Look at this map. This is the layout of the New South Wales Parliament in 1899. In the blue are the protectionists led by Edmund Barton, in the yellow are the free traders led by George Reid, and in the red are Labor, who was supporting Reid's government. The reality was that Barton was an awful opposition leader. Having successfully built a coalition of different supporters for Federation, Barton didn't want to put any key players offside.
It's official. Australian Federation has bipartisan support with the two major political parties, agreeing to support the concept.
The protectionists replaced Barton with an anti-federalist attack dog, William Lyne. Lyne successfully persuaded Labor to abandon Reid, and as Federation loomed at the end of the year, the deal was that the New South Wales Premier would get to become Prime Minister. But now this was very awkward. The new Premier of New South Wales actually opposed Federation. Instead, a new deal had to be reached. As the architect of the Australian Constitution, Lyne agreed that Barton should instead become the first Australian Prime Minister. But as part of a delegation that went to London to finalise the new Australia, Lyne realised just how much power the Prime Minister could have. He totally changed his mind and assumed the role of inaugural Prime Minister of Australia. So 2025 is just a number of days away, and a number of you guys have told me that your New Year's resolution is to actually learn Australian history. This video is basically a starting point for that journey, and depending on your budget, could lead you to two places. Firstly, if you picked up a spare $20 over Christmas, head on over to join the 10 Prime Ministers in 10 Days course. Some of today's lecture snippets are from that course, and it has activities to consolidate your learning too. The modules are all there for you, and for just an hour a day, you'll be an expert by January the 10th. But if you don't have the cash, still join our website for free. You'll get a study guide PDF for where to direct your research to get knowledge gains quite quickly. If you're interested in exclusively later or more modern Australian history, hold on to your cash for now because I've got a much better investment opportunity. That sounds like a CoffeeZilla scam when I say it out loud. Anyway, I'm rolling with it. We've got a much better investment opportunity for you in the next couple of days. Today's made up of old channel videos mixed in with course content, and we'll get started with Federation. In 1900, a country the size of a continent simply just came into existence. What started as a set of British colonies that were designed to punish its criminals, this new country, Australia, now stood with a landmass of 32 times that of its mother country. But unlike the USA, there was no war of independence, and no common enemy for these independent colonies to rally around. They simply agreed to federate. And so premiers who had all sorts of localised power over their British colonies now surrendered that to this emerging colossus of a federal government. No dramas, right? Well, not even close. This is the inside story of the history of Australian Parliament. The power struggles, the conniving lies, and in the midst of all of these, the unbelievable triumphs. Okay, so welcome to our first episode of Labor, Liberal and Lies. I'm so pumped to be beginning this series, and we're going to begin our first episode by of course looking at Australia's first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton. But to understand him and the power struggles that went on in his cabinet, we have to understand the background of Federation. And so Barton was an especially strong negotiator who started as a member of the New South Wales colonial government back in 1880. In fact, his knack for negotiating disputes was recognised so early, and he was made the Speaker of the House. In Australia, the Speaker rescinds their voting rights to convene Parliament and ensure order in the House. Order! And so during this era, the New South Wales Parliament was beginning to split into two factions. On the one hand, there were the free traders led by Sir Henry Parkes, and as the name suggests, they advocated for minimal taxes on foreign imports and advocated for increased trade in a world that was becoming far more connected. On the other hand, there were Barton's protectionists who wanted to protect Australian industries by taxing imports from other countries. There was also a third party in the mix, the Labor Party. This was a party made up of unionists and blue-collar workers, and they typically sided with the protectionists as they advocated for the protection of Australian industries. But they sometimes sided with the free traders too. And so this will be today's subscriber question. If you were alive in Barton's era, who would you vote for? The protectionists, the free traders, or for Labor? But back to Barton. In 1889, the legendary Premier and Barton's rival, Sir Henry Parkes, gave his famous Tenterfield speech where he urged the Australian colonies to form a united federation, and Barton was really captivated by this. From there, momentum started to grow and there was a federal convention held in Sydney, and Barton was selected as one of 7 delegates from New South Wales. Essentially, at this convention, Barton wrote most of what would become the Australian Constitution. Now, close to death, the legendary Parkes resigned as the Premier, and he was replaced by fellow free trader and Federation advocate, George Reid. He'll become really important next week. And so, fast forward to 1897 and a second federal convention was held. Essentially, the smaller colonies like Tasmania and South Australia were advocating for a Senate that had more power than the lower house. You see, the House of Reps is voted according to electorates, and elections are determined by population. Alternatively, the Senate is elected according to each state receiving an allocation. As South Australia and Tasmania had less people than New South Wales and Victoria, a powerful Senate would suit them. But for Victoria and New South Wales, this was completely undemocratic and totally unacceptable. But like I said, Barton knew how to compromise and proposed that the Senate could have veto power, but not on financial bills. And so Federation was to go ahead. Each colony was to have a referendum on whether they wanted to join this new Australia. And even if Western Australia and Queensland didn't vote yes, like some suspected, the southeastern colonies knew they could form their own union regardless. But in New South Wales, there was to be a big hiccup. You see, George Reid's free trader controlled parliament said that New South Wales didn't just need a majority, which was around 68,000 votes, they needed a clear majority of 80,000, and they fell short. The yes vote did win, but it only won 71,500 to 66,000. Even though they were on opposite sides, Barton had long seen Reid as an ally for the Federation cause, and he felt utterly betrayed. So, what do? Well, Barton then went and challenged Reid in his own seat for the 1898 New South Wales election, and he only narrowly lost.
Have you come to destroy me, Obi-Wan?
I will do what I must.
Then you will die.
Even so, a protectionist backbencher stepped down for Barton and he became the opposition leader. So, Barton continued to lobby harder for Federation, and he got his victory on a revote, with New South Wales achieving 107,500 votes for yes and 83,000 votes for no. But despite this, Barton was too much of a negotiator to be an effective opposition leader, and he stepped down for anti-federalist William Lyne. For this election cycle, Labor had been working with the Free Traders, but Lyne persuaded them to desert Reid for the Protectionists, and he became the Premier. Now, this was important because the general agreement was that the New South Wales Premier would be the first Prime Minister because they were the senior colony. But after all, Lyne didn't even believe in the cause. And so this was the deal. Lyne would nominate Barton to be the Prime Minister on his behalf, while he would continue to govern New South Wales as his Premier. But of course, before all this could happen, the British government had to sign off on it because they were British colonies. And so Barton led the delegation that went to Britain, but Britain pushed back against Barton's idea for an Australian High Court. They argued that the highest court in Australia should be a British court because that's where the expertise on British common law was. Barton's rebuttal was simple. We wrote the Constitution, we have the right to interpret it. The matter was settled and the laws were about to go through, but there'd be one final twist. William Lyne seemed to have a change of heart. Now that Federation was happening, regardless of whether he liked it or not, he was about to turn down the most powerful post on the continent, and so Lyne set sail for the motherland to take the post as Australian Prime Minister. Obviously, Barton was incensed and refused to join the cabinet of ministers that Lyne was forming. Ironically, Barton's foe, George Reid, was the one who came to the rescue. Reid and Barton had their ideological differences, but they were united on the need for a federation, and they were friends. For Reid, a protectionist was going to be Prime Minister no matter what, so better his friend Barton than the unknown rival in Lyne. Reid persuaded all the premiers from other states to refuse to join Lyne's cabinet, and Lyne had no choice but to stand down. Barton would return to Australia as his Prime Minister-elect. So Barton's cabinet was supposed to be the dream team. Effectively, there were 6 ex-premiers serving as his ministers, and they got to work right away by implementing tariffs. Interestingly, these tariffs were less to protect industry, but actually to raise revenue for this new Commonwealth government because the states got to keep their income and land tax rights at this stage. The first notable policy that the Barton government passed would go down as one of Australia's most notorious policies of all time. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, otherwise known as the White Australia Policy. Now, yes, this was a racist policy, but there was a little bit more to it than meets the eye. Like I said, the protectionists wanted to protect Australian industry and Labor wanted to protect Australian workers. Now, what had happened was that Queensland were using Pacific Islanders basically as slave labour in its cane fields. This led to the belief that non-Europeans would price Australian workers out of work, and so the proposal was that only Europeans be allowed migration into Australia. But this greatly upset the motherland. Britain had a worldwide empire that included India and a growing alliance with Japan. Having initially proposed a 50-word dictation test in English, Barton compromised and allowed the test to be in any European language. The government also compensated the sugar industry by placing bounties on sugar grown by white labour. Now, in the 1901 election, Barton's protectionists won 32 seats, the Free Traders picked up 27, and Labour picked up 16 and threw its support behind Barton's protectionists once again. However, the early 1900s was an era of loose party discipline. Today, parties always vote as a unified bloc unless the leader of the party allows for a conscience vote, usually on social issues such as abortion. But the early 1900s saw a system closer to America's, where dissenting voices were allowed, and the party was nothing more binding than, say, a Survivor Alliance.
Poverty. Tyson.
After this election, Barton would go on to have two main accomplishments. Number one, an old age pension was introduced, and number two, Barton established the High Court of Australia that he fought against the British for, and that's about to get really important. So basically, there was one bill which tore the Australian Parliament apart during the beginning of the century, which was the Conciliation and Arbitration Bill. Essentially, this was a bill to set up a court that would hear industrial matters and establish the rule of law within the workplace. For instance, someone working on the docks could take their boss to this court for not paying their wages. Now, this sounds like a no-brainer, right? But the specifics tore Parliament apart. Firstly, Barton's Trade Minister, Charles Kingston, proposed that the bill also extend to merchant seamen. Now, this proposal was rejected by the protectionists. Like I said before, party discipline was loose in the early years of Federation. And so, to Barton's surprise, Kingston just resigned. If, as the Minister for Trade, he couldn't get his way on an industrial bill, what influence could he actually wield? This created a huge issue for the protectionists though. Kingston was the most trusted protectionist minister in the eyes of Labour, and this key coalition was starting to fracture. Labour also had its issues with the bill wanting state government employees like railway workers covered under the Act. With the cabinet being made up of many ex-state premiers who would see their colleagues constantly embattled in court, the protectionists rejected it. And so Australia was left in a standoff. The protectionists needed Labour to govern, yet they rejected Labour's proposal. Ever the negotiator, Barton desperately tried to rescue the coalition, but to no avail. And so the first Prime Minister shocked the nation by resigning and taking up a position on the High Court that he himself had set up. And so Australia was given its second Prime Minister, Alfred Deakin, and he had the impossible job of reunifying the coalition. Deakin was a funny fellow, a legendary orator who in the 19th century had served in the Victorian colonial parliament. His maiden speech also happened to be his resignation speech, as there were doubts over his polling. Now, Deakin knew that there was no saving this fractured relationship, and so he waited 6 months for the 1903 election to roll around. He gambled that the public would see how ineffective a three-party system was, and that Labour voters would flip to the protectionists. In December, the polls came in. The protectionists picked up 26 seats, their opposition, the Free Traders, picked up 24, but to Deakin's surprise, Labour picked up 22. This was the three-way tie. Deakin's nightmare scenario. You could easily swap the protectionist numbers in blue with the Free Traders numbers over in that lime green. By the way, I'm colorblind. They might not actually be those colors, but they look like that to me. And that's what a pretty typical parliament would look like, or a pretty typical legislative assembly, to use the kind of correct vernacular. And again, if you just look at Labor's numbers there, Labor can just swap over to the Free Traders at any point, and when they're at the Free Traders, they can go back to the protectionists, and Labor really have a lot of power in that sort of political arrangement. It's important to note that who are the two most important colonies? Well, New South Wales is number one, but then a close second is Victoria as well. And Victoria is moving towards political parties. They don't have them in hard and fast defined terms, but certainly they are moving in that direction. They've got the Labor Party, and over time, that liberal-conservative dichotomy was starting to create a bit of a divide. So, we start to move towards the Constitution, and start to move towards Federation in the 1890s. And we have our first convention that is held there. And if you look at that photo, I'll zoom it up in just a moment. You can see a couple of familiar faces there. So a number of delegates were chosen by the Parliament. So each colonial Parliament chose some representatives to represent them at a meeting to discuss the idea of a federation. Think about it as France and Germany and whoever else putting forward representatives from their parliaments to represent them at the EU. That's kind of the process that was going on there. In this meeting, most of the Constitution was drafted, but there was a a kind of twist of fate that would help determine how the Constitution was formed. So there's a guy called Angus Clark. He was a representative from Tasmania. He was supposed to be one of the key figures in drafting the Constitution, but he was away sick. And so Edmund Barton actually filled in, and Barton's quite fantastic legal mind proved to be really important in actually drafting that Australian Constitution. Both the Free Traders and the Protectionists supported federation, and they made that pretty clear in the first convention. Labor, far less keen, but there was some support starting to grow. And it's important to note that the delegates to represent each colony were chosen by the Parliament, not chosen by the people. So, we have, bring myself back into focus. We have something called the Cowra Conference in 1893. Now, this wasn't a Federation convention. It was kind of the hype show for the Federation convention, so to speak. The pre-game entertainment. And at the Cowra Conference, there were calls that the people should elect their own representatives to represent them at these constitutional conventions or at these Federation conventions, the same way that they would choose people to represent them in Parliament. So that was the first convention. I'm going to put a photo on the screen right here. Sorry, my baby woke up there, so just kind of hearing that in the background. Have a look at this photo on the screen. As you can see, there's a whole number of people. A couple of key ones that I'm going to draw your attention to. So if you look at my mouse here, I'll draw your attention to Angus Clark. So that's the guy that was sick. Edmund Barton isn't in this photo. You've got Henry Parkes over here. And the last guy I want to draw your attention to is I want to draw your attention to Alfred Deakin, who is chilling here. Deakin ends up becoming Prime Minister on 3 occasions. Actually beats Kevin Rudd in terms of number of times served in office. We left last week with the 1903 election split into what was essentially a 3-way tie between the Protectionists, the Free Traders, and Labor. Having previously been able to bank on Labor's votes, the failed passing of the Conciliation and Arbitration Bill divided Alfred Deakin's coalition government. During that same summer, the summer of 1903 to 1904, the English cricket team was touring Australia, and this prompted Deakin to express his frustration. What kind of cricket can be played with 3 11s, he went on record saying. With Parliament in gridlock and 3 voting blocks all pitted against each other, Deakin was about to take one of the biggest gambles in Australian history. He went to Labor's leader, Chris Watson, and said that his Protectionists would support Labor in leading a coalition government. Deakin effectively handed over the office of Prime Minister to Labor. Okay, so this chapter of Australian history is a really great one because the flipping hits a new level, but it is important to note that Watson's new Labor-led coalition was the first national Labor government to take place anywhere in the world. However, Deakin was completely playing them. If you missed it last week, Labor refused to pass the Protectionist Conciliation and Arbitration Bill because the Industrial Tribunal didn't cover state government employees like railway workers. After Edmund Barton failed to negotiate an agreement, he resigned to the High Court and his successor, Alfred Deakin, was banking on winning a majority in the 1903 election. And so, having agreed to play second fiddle to Labor, Deakin was hoping to do 2 things. On the one hand, Deakin wanted to show that Labor truly was a minority and that by itself it was powerless to pass legislation. And then secondly, he wanted to show them that governance was a tough responsibility that required compromise. It was very easy to throw shade from the sideline when you don't have to try and directly win the vote of most Australians. Deakin's Protectionists gave Labor the same treatment that they gave Barton and blocked any attempt of theirs at passing the Conciliation and Arbitration Bill. In fact, Deakin went as far as calling Labor member and future Prime Minister Billy Hughes an ill-bred urchin who one sees dragged from a tart shop kicking and screaming as he goes. It was probably a mad burn for the early 20th century. But Deakin wasn't done in putting Labor in its place. He did the unthinkable and then aligned with George Reid's Free Traders to form a new government. Just think about that oxymoron for a second. The Free Traders and the Protectionists were in a coalition government. That's like the Australian Progressive Party and Cory Bernardi's Conservative Party being in a coalition. They're by definition opposites. So effectively, Deakin let Labor govern for a few months, and after showing them how tough governing in a minority could be, he pulled the pin and sent his Protectionists across the aisle to back George Reid's Free Traders. And in terms of bringing Labor back under its thumb, mission accomplished. Outgoing Prime Minister Watson even said, "We don't want office, we just want to stop the retrogressive movement that Reid is heading." And for Labor, the message was clear. Failure to side with the Protectionists would result in a free trader government. So George Reid was Australia's 4th Prime Minister in as many years. Though Deakin was a great orator, he actually had nothing on Reid, with some even labelling the new Prime Minister as the best orator across the empire. He seemed to have something of Churchill's wit too. In reference to his weight, he was once asked by a heckler what he'd call the baby. Reid replied, "If it's a boy, I'll name it after myself. If it's a girl, I'll call her Victoria. But if, as I strongly suspect, it's nothing but wind, I'll name it after you."
Wickedly funny.
I guess history's just whittled it down to the gems.
Now, Reid had 2 historical enemies. The first was actually his predecessor, Sir Henry Parkes, who led the Free Traders before him, and his second was his new coalition ally, Alfred Deakin. You see, Reid had enjoyed a good relationship with Edmund Barton despite their political rivalry, and Reid even bailed out Barton when William Lyon tried to snake him out of being Australia's first Prime Minister. And so even though the Protectionists sided with Reid, Deakin refused to serve in Reid's cabinet, and this would be a sign of how hamstrung Reid's Free Traders would be. Within 2 weeks, Watson, who was now with his tail between his legs after Deakin played him, signalled a vote of no confidence in Reid.
You could call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum.
I move for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum's leadership.
However, Reid's government was to make some achievements. Firstly, the Free Traders could actually pass the Conciliation and Arbitration Bill because unlike Labor, they had no interest in protecting state workers, and so actually found common ground with the Protectionists. Secondly, Reid actually passed a Seat of Government Act which secured the nation's capital as Dalgety, or the fact that I don't know how to pronounce it's about to prove my point. Reid had long advocated for a capital within New South Wales as the price of having the most senior colony lead the country in Federation, and it was nearly exactly halfway between Sydney and Melbourne. But you might be thinking, wait, Canberra's the capital of Australia? Well, more on that in a later episode, but had later parliaments pursued Reid's plan, Dalgety would have a whole lot more than 205 people living there today. Unfortunately for Reid, though he had a temporary coalition, he was simply outgunned by the Protectionists and Labor. But that wouldn't stop him from one last roll of the dice. If Reid could peddle anti-socialist hysteria hard enough, that could create enough dirt to stick on the walls of Labor and the Protectionists in an election. So, what if he used his oratory to really go on the attack and slam socialism, and then after that seek a dissolution of Parliament and have new elections?
Hey, this guy's a commie!
Hey, keep it quiet! Where'd a nice little boy like you learn such a bad word like that, huh?
Commie, traitor to our country!
When Parliament resumed in 1905, Watson immediately denounced Reid again, but this time the killing blow came when Deakin withdrew his party support for the Free Traders. Reid pressed for that dissolution he was so after, but it was denied by the Governor-General, and so he stepped down. In his wake, Alfred Deakin would return as the nation's Prime Minister. He'd been patient, calculated, and now back from the dead, he was in a far stronger position with Labor firmly under his control. Or was he? Labor had a new member who had growing influence within the party, and he wasn't about to roll over like John Watson had. His name was Andrew Fisher. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing so that you don't miss a single episode in this series. Next week, we're looking at Deakin's second stint in power and the challenges he faced with Labor's new leader, Andrew Fisher. Oh, and Teddy Roosevelt will be popping in too. We left last week with Deakin's much anticipated return to the head office. Having voluntarily ceded control to Labor and then stabbing them in the back to support George Reid's Free Traders, he brought Labor back on side to then backstab Reid. But after just a year in office, Deakin had to face off against Reid in the 1906 election. This time, Reid had rebranded his Free Trader Party to become the Anti-Socialist Party, and he went hard on the attack. Having stabbed Watson in the back and having stabbed Reid in the back, what was to stop Deakin stabbing capitalist Australia in the back? The results came in, and Deakin retained the office of Prime Minister, but it wasn't good news for him. His constant flipping had cost the Protectionists 10 seats in Parliament, and the Labor Protectionist coalition was completely imbalanced. The Protectionists held 16 seats to Labor's 26. Deakin wasn't just leading a minority government, he was a minority within the minority government. Okay, so this episode is a tasty one, and you might actually notice some similar themes to last week. Make sure to hang around until the end to take part in this week's subscriber question as well. But before we get to the backstabbing, we probably should talk policy, because Deakin's second stint as Prime Minister actually saw Australia make some strides away from the British. Essentially, the two had different perspectives on what to do with Japan. For the British, they'd played a huge role in the Meiji Restoration and helped Japan to industrialise, and they were important naval allies. But if you know your Japanese history, you'd know that 1905 was a huge year for Nippon because it was the first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European nation when Japan beat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. For Deakin, he was pretty concerned by this because a strong Japanese naval presence was now a new security issue in the Pacific. As a result, Deakin took keen interest in British New Guinea, the southeastern quarter of what's today called Papua New Guinea. Queensland had previously tried to annex it in 1883, but the British had denied them. However, in 1902, Britain ceded the territory over to Australia, and in 1905, the Deakin government passed the Papua Act to begin the process of Australian administration. Then, in 1907, Deakin wanted Australia to have a more decisive voice on foreign policy at Britain's Imperial Conference, but he was largely rebuffed.
How come I never get any lines in these things?
Shut up, Meg.
In response, Deakin started to assert something of Australian independence as he reached out to none other than Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt allowed the American Great White Fleet to visit Australia in 1908, and they were greeted by 500,000 Australians in Sydney, the largest gathering of Australians up until this point. With all this fanfare, Deakin had the public support in commissioning an Australian Navy, and preparation began with compulsory military training also being introduced. By making his request directly to American diplomats rather than through the imperial authorities, Deakin had defied protocol, but this would be crucial for Australian independence from the motherland. With Deakin so deeply in the pockets of Labor, he set up an arbitration court to determine a fair wage, and the system would go something like this. If the court found your business paid your workers a quote-unquote fair wage, well then the business would be exempt from the domestic tariffs that protectionists were known for putting on businesses. As a result, with no one having to pay those extra taxes to buy your product, they would be incentivized to buy from you. And so this new court delivered its famous Harvester judgment, where it defined what this fair wage was to be. Now, it didn't put a number on it, but instead said that a living wage had to be able to support a wife and 3 children in frugal comfort, while a skilled worker should receive an extra margin for their skills, and this is the key bit, that extra margin should be regardless of the employer's capacity to pay. And so minimum wages were not to be set through the free market like in America, but by an external arbitrator. Australia was well and truly living up to its status as the working man's paradise. In 1908, the Deakin government added an old age pension, and then construction began on an east to west transcontinental railway, but Deakin himself was to be railroaded. Like I said before, in Deakin's coalition government, Labor held the balance of power 26 seats to 16. And so after being egged on by his Labor members, their new leader, Andrew Fisher, decided to remove support for the protectionists, going solo to form their own government.
Do it.
Okay, so Fisher has quite an interesting backstory. He was a classic unionist, but actually rose through the ranks in quite tragic circumstances. His father suffered debilitating injuries in Scottish coal mines in the 1800s, and so just a boy, Fisher put himself into those same mines to feed his family. What was also interesting was that in 1899 the Boer War broke out in South Africa between the British Empire and the Dutch-based Boer republics. Australia wasn't federated at this point, but each of the 6 colonies independently supported the war. However, Fisher, now a member of the Queensland Parliament, vehemently opposed it, which put him on the map. Essentially, after the 1906 election which saw Deakin's protectionists crippled, Labor's leader, Chris Watson, stepped down. Leadership was then contested between 2 people. Obviously Fisher, who'd moved from the Queensland Parliament to the Federal Parliament, but then someone else who will pan out to be way more important in future episodes, Billy Hughes. Now, Fisher edged out Hughes and his government passed some minor reforms. Firstly, they passed a new Seat of Government Act which overturned George Reed's Act that had established Dalgety as the nation's capital. A new federal capital was to be built in the Yass-Canberra area. Secondly, Fisher's government passed the Manufacturers Encouragement Act to provide bounties for iron and steel manufacturers who paid fair and reasonable wages to their workers. Okay, that was such a selfish cutaway. Like the video if you want more LEGO Star Wars cutaways that remind you of a time in life where your biggest worry was whether or not you'd pack Benji in your Atomic Tomato Sandboys. Anyway, back to Fisher. He carried on with Deakin's naval building plans by expanding the Australian fleet with 3 more destroyers. However, his betrayal of Deakin completely ruined their friendship, and as with Fisher's predecessor, Chris Watson, Deakin was out for blood, whatever the cost. In a meeting in Melbourne's Parliament House, Deakin met with the new leader of the Anti-Socialist Party, Joseph Cook. Now remember, the Anti-Socialists were formerly known as the Free Traders, and Deakin had temporarily sided with the Free Traders as we saw last week, but that was just to teach Labor a lesson and put them in their place. But Deakin's new idea was outrageous. If the Protectionists and Anti-Socialists merged their parties together, not as a coalition of two parties but as a singular party, they would have the numbers to snatch government away from Labor. Just let that sink in. Deakin proposed the Protectionists and what used to be the Free Traders merge into one party. Like I said last time, just imagine the Australian Progressive Party and the Australian Conservative Party merging. They're by definition complete opposites. Cook was on board with this, and the two officially merged to become the Fusion Party. Now, obviously this incensed some Protectionist MPs, as the very principle that they stood for was sold out, and so they defected to Labor. When this was announced before Parliament, the usually non-partisan Speaker of the House, Sir Frederick Holder, shouted, "Terrible, terrible." William Lyne, whom you might remember for trying to snake Edmund Barton out of leadership, called Deakin Judas. But regardless of the jeers in Parliament, in 1909 for a third time, Deakin was back. But Deakin had to make quick work because an election was around the corner in 1910 and Fisher wanted his revenge. Strangely, Deakin's physical and mental prowess was on the decline, and he really struggled with memory. So going into the election, things looked grim. Deakin was seen not only as a backstabber, but also as a Joe Biden-like gaffe machine.
Hey everyone, I'm Joe Biden's husband.
So Deakin needed a PR win. He couldn't go into the election as the Fusion Party because that word reminded the public of Deakin's deal with Cook. Instead, Deakin's party would go by the name of something else.
The Liberal Government!
Well, kind of. Deakin's Liberal Party wasn't the same as the one we see today. That one was launched by Menzies after World War II, but nonetheless the foundations for the modern Liberal Party were in place. And going into 1910, for the first time in our history, Australia was preparing for a Liberal-Labor showdown. Now, a little bit about Andrew Fisher. He had a background in terms of like Scottish background, worked in the mines. What was really interesting is that he was from Gympie in Queensland. Now, I don't know how many of you guys are tuning in from the Sunshine Coast. I went to see my mate recently. I know it's a running joke that people in Gympie have two heads. Is that the sort of like Sunshine Coast banter? I don't really know the suburb banter that well in the Sunshine Coast. But he was seen as an underdog. Again, this is a guy who's come from Gympie of all places. He's not royalty from Sydney. He's not royalty from Melbourne. And this is the guy who's gone on to become the first majority Prime Minister in the nation. So quite an amazing feat for Andrew Fisher. And yeah, what's really interesting is that he goes on to have majority government, and now he's got what we call a mandate to go on and to pass a whole bunch of reforms that were otherwise seen untouchable. So let's have a look at some of them. So again, Andrew Fisher right here, just what a moustache that is. Yeah, very well-groomed man. And actually, as he would kind of mature and get older in age, Fisher would actually be seen as quite a pro-British guy. And he ended up having the job of basically Australia's Commissioner to London. But he was really influential in shaping the policy direction of Australia. So let's have a little look at him. What were the key policies that Andrew Fisher passed? Actually, I'm just going to start with a very basic one that isn't that related to the broader structure of society. It's actually what gets to be the capital. And this is really interesting because last time we spoke about George Reid wanting to make Dalgety the capital, and that was one of his very few policies that he actually passed was the seat of Dalgety. Oh, sorry, the Capital Seat Act, in which Dalgety was nominated as the capital. A lot of people opposed this because it was considered as being too close to Victoria. So the compromise was it's got to be 160 kilometres away from Sydney, but New South Wales gets the capital because they're the senior colony. And a lot of New South Welshmen weren't happy with this because it was seen as being too close to Victoria and basically like a Victorian embassy in New South Wales. Remember, Federation hasn't lasted for long. There are still very tribal outlooks when it comes to state. Fisher's from Queensland, so Fisher doesn't really care about that. So Fisher is actually a huge supporter of it being in Dalgety. He does not want Canberra to be the capital. So in 1908, what Fisher does is there's just an open vote in Parliament. You can kind of go whatever direction you want to go for. Where do you want the capital to be? And Canberra actually ended up edging out Dalgety. And so back in 1908, it was technically passed as Canberra to be the new capital. But really making it, I guess, executing it and implementing it came in 1910, when basically legislation came to pass that Canberra will be the capital, and we're going to designate some resources there to actually seeing that come to fruition. So really interestingly, Fisher, against his own instincts, actually greenlights Canberra becoming the capital rather than Dalgety. So the Raiders have Andrew Fisher to thank for that. But the next one is just a really bad. I won't spend too much time labouring this one. Northern Territory Acceptance Acts, which meant that control of the Northern Territory went from New South Wales to the federal government. Northern Territory used to be controlled by South Australia before that, so it's kind of gone through a couple of different hands, but now it's seen as being a federal territory. Next one is really interesting as well. We've got the Naval Defence Act of 1910. What's interesting about this was that Deakin had made moves for the Australian Navy to kind of start to begin in its foundation. So before we get that, Barton had gone, we'll kind of support the British Empire's Navy. Deakin had gone, we need our own Navy. And then Andrew Fisher started to implement that into practice in 1910. The most interesting thing was that, I guess, we had our own military college set up. And Dundrum Military College was set up, if you know where that is, it's in Canberra. So it's not only the fact that we're setting up our own Navy, it's actually the fact that we are starting to put a lot of infrastructure into Canberra and really making that our capital city. So I just had to blow my nose then. No one wants to say that. Next thing is probably my favourite policy that Andrew Fisher passed because it was really contentious at the time. So this was the Land Tax Act, I should say, of 1910. So it was a tax on land, but it was a little bit more complex than that. It was a tax on land that was unimproved, and that was the key language that was used at the time. Basically what this meant, so if you kind of think through kind of where Australia's at the time, before I get to that point, if you think through where Australia's at the time, Australia is developing as a country, and the Australian government would like to own land to kind of build infrastructure and to build cities and to build regional towns. So let's just take Armidale, for example. So you got this city called Armidale, that kind of ends up having some like separatist sentiment 10 or 20 years later. Story for another day. Armidale, you've got, again, you want to build roads, you want to build hospitals, whatever, and you don't want to just kind of take land off of people in a hostile way. You want to kind of reach a middle point between incentivizing people to sell land that they won't share. So in Armidale, what happens is you get all these people coming from Britain who are seeing that people are coming to Australia, people are migrating to Australia because it's the workers' paradise. I'm just going to come in, I'm going to buy land, and I am going to bank on the fact that there'll be enough migrants that come that the value of that land will jack up in value. Am I going to do anything with that land? No. Am I going to use it for farming or anything like that? No. Can it be used for building the city and kind of working in society's common good? No. So Fisher basically wants to kind of help alleviate that issue and to incentivize them not to speculate in the Australian housing market. Again, I'm a Gen Zer looking to buy a house at some point. Must be nice to have a government that would care for that. So basically what happened was Andrew Fisher kind of put in a progressive tax system, and the more land that you had that wasn't being cultivated or improved at all, the more you'd have to pay in tax. Obviously, powerful people are not going to like this very much because it's really affecting their investment, and so people challenge it in the Constitution. People challenge it in the High Court, arguing that this isn't constitutional. The High Court actually sides with Andrew Fisher and says this is constitutional, and so it's actually allowed to go through. When it came to the revenue that it generated, wasn't heaps and heaps of revenue, but just a nice little healthy bit to the budget, nearly around £1.5 million. So a nice little bit for the budget to come in as well, and a decent flow of revenue coming into the government's coffers. The main thing that they're worried about, apart from just getting revenue, is actually making sure that it can build the infrastructure and build the society that it wants to, and it won't be interfered with by foreign people using Australian land as a form of investment. You've then got the Commonwealth Bank Act of 1911. This one is also really interesting. The reason why is that the Commonwealth Bank was set up as part a Federal Reserve and then part a commercial bank as well. So initially it was just designed to be a commercial bank, but over time it started to become a Federal Reserve as well and became the government's way of controlling the money supply. So it's a government-owned bank. In theory, it's supposed to be competitive with private banks because it's not incentivized by making profit because it's owned by the government. And so the theory was they could offer more competitive rates because it's not as concerned with making profit at the end of the year, and it can get loans to people who otherwise would be denied loans by the private system. And the theory is that this can kind of stimulate further investment because people are getting loans, and that can kind of create healthy businesses down the track from people that otherwise would be rejected by private banks. And we're happy to take the losses that come with that. You can see how over time that would become quite a liability for the government. And you've got then the really contentious decision made by Paul Keating to then sell the Commonwealth Bank on in the 1990s. Story for another day. That's kind of the background for how, why, and what happened there. What's really interesting is that over time, it then started to become the Federal Reserve as well. And it wasn't until, if I'm not mistaken, 1953, where Robert Menzies actually said, no, we need to separate these two. You've got your Federal Reserve and your Commonwealth Bank, and they're actually different things. So the Commonwealth Bank is set up in 1911. And then the last policy that I think is really important to discuss is the Workers' Compensation Act of 1912. And what's really interesting with this act is that it only protects Commonwealth employees. So it's a step in the right direction because now you can get workers' compensation if you get injured, but you just have to be working for the federal government to get that. And so Fisher knows that private businesses won't like that very much, particularly if you're a wealthy mining business. He knows that they're not going to like that very much, so he just starts with Commonwealth employees, but that certainly gets spread and expanded over time. So as you can see, Andrew Fisher, quite a strong government in terms of passing what it wanted to pass. Again, this isn't like one of the former weak governments that needs to constantly rely on coalition with one of the partners and can actually just pass what it wants to pass. So some very key policies, then it wasn't just these ones, but I've just chosen these as 6 highlights, some very key policies that were passed in Andrew Fisher's tenure. And so you'd expect going into 1913, these for the most part seem in the public's broader interest. You would expect that most people would be supportive of policies like this. He's setting up a bank to help you. He's giving you workers' compensation. He's making sure that you can actually get land at an affordable rate because he's taxing people that are hoarding all the land. And you would think that that would float pretty well with the majority of the population. But if we have a look at the 1913 election, at least in the House of Representatives, Labor gets beaten. So 37-38 in the House of Reps. The Liberal Party actually wins the majority. And so people are like, well, how did Andrew Fisher actually lose from here? Again, you would think that he'd be on pretty strong footing, particularly because the Liberal Party is still dealing with a hangover of being a fusion party. One of the perhaps biggest mistakes that Andrew Fisher made, this is kind of pretty strong consensus amongst historians, was that Andrew Fisher decided it would be convenient to add 6 referendums to the election. So when you go in on ballot day in 1913, what would happen is you'd go House of Representatives, you'd get your massive Senate piece of paper out, then you'd get 6 little pamphlets and you'd have to go yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And all of the referendums were pretty much on expanding the government's powers, the federal government's powers in certain areas. So the Liberal Party campaigns on the fact that the Labor Party is trying to dictate your lives. They're really authoritarian. We're the Liberal Party. You can live your life freely under us. Again, they're quite Ben Shapiro talking points if you think about it. So what actually happens is as you're doing those referendums, all six referendums were rejected. As you were doing those referendums, you're like, no, I don't want the federal government to have that much power. And stuff you, Labor, you are kind of expanding the tentacles of government so far into people's lives. And so Australia actually rejects Labor at the polls in 1913. As you can see, they lost 38-37. What is really interesting, though, is the Senate, because the Liberal Party does not sweep up in the Senate at all. In fact, they get smashed in the Senate. So it actually ends up 29-7. And if you've got kind of any sense of how politics works, I think you can see where this is going. Every law that the Liberal Party is going to pass, or every bill that the Liberal Party is hoping to get through Parliament, the Labor Party is going to reject. If you know Australian political history well, that might seem reminiscent of a time where the shoe was on the other foot, and the Labor Party is trying to pass a bill, and the Liberal Party saying no in the Senate. That was, of course, Gough Whitlam trying to pass supply, which then led to his sacking in a very controversial way. Since the Australian colonies merged, only one party has survived until today, Labour. But as they met in Canberra during World War I, the party was in disarray.
This is a crisis for Labour as its leader faces expulsion.
To expel not only your party leader, but the sitting Prime Minister was unheard of in democracies. But Hughes wouldn't leave it to chance, demanding that those who stood with him on conscription leave with him. 23 out of 42 Labour MPs left to join a new party, National Labour. Quickly, Hughes' renegade party joined forces with the Liberal Party to take government away from old Labour. This new party would evolve to become the United Australia Party, of which Hughes would be its leader in World War II, becoming the only person to lead a major democratic party in both world wars. But this only begs the question, why is it that most Australians don't know him? So in 1988, Australia was commemorating 200 years of British Australian history, and we were kind of doing like a Watch Mojo top 200 contributors. Interestingly, what the committee couldn't actually determine was whether Hughes should be on there or not, because they couldn't decide whether he'd built the nation or destroyed the nation. Now, Hughes had always been a fiery character. For instance, when Alfred Deakin pulled his protectionists out of coalition with Labor to instead fuse with the Free Traders to form the Liberal Party, Hughes said, "I hear from this side of the house some mention of Judas. I do not agree with that. It is not fair to Judas, for whom there is this so be said. He did not gag the man whom he betrayed, nor did he fail to hang himself afterwards." Now, up until World War I, Hughes was Labor's number 2, playing second fiddle to a guy called Andrew Fisher. Fisher had only edged Hughes out by 1 vote in 1907, and for the first year of the war, the nation was led by Fisher. But things didn't go so well for him.
Commonwealth soldiers land on the beaches of Gallipoli to try and surprise the Turks.
So the famous Gallipoli landings were actually orchestrated behind Fisher's back by the British. With a stalemate on both the east and the west, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill ordered a new attack through the Dardanelles. Given that Australian troops were training over here in Cairo, it made sense for Australia to play a key role in the invasion. And with the Ottoman Turks neutralised, a supply route to Russia could open up, which would help them on the Eastern Front. So Fisher did eventually find out about the Gallipoli landings on April the 26th. If you know Anzac Day, you know that's actually 1 day after the Gallipoli landings took place. Yeah, imagine like an Allied leader not knowing that D-Day was going to happen. So obviously the British were showing an incredibly disrespectful attitude towards Fisher, and it didn't help that he was starting to struggle with his health and showing some signs of going senile. So what about Billy Hughes? Where's he in all of this? Well, whereas Fisher was struggling, Hughes was thriving.
Many in the Labour Party believe that instead of Fisher, Hughes should be the leader.
For instance, in 1914, when Fisher went to New Zealand to coordinate Anzac forces, Hughes was acting Prime Minister, and his dynamism was a refreshing change of pace from Fisher's weariness. But it wasn't just that. Hughes had real policy accomplishments to point towards, particularly the creation of the Australian Metals Exchange. German factories had been huge purchasers of Australian metals, and so Hughes tasked himself with finding those metal companies a new market. So by the end of 1915, Australia had been unsuccessful in Gallipoli and were having to retreat. Fisher had been an incredibly effective peacetime Prime Minister, passing dozens of key laws, but with the early enthusiasm for the war waning, it really needed fresh leadership. So in October, a weary Fisher stood down, and there was no question as to who Labor would choose to replace him: Billy Hughes. But just a year later, those same people were calling for his head. So what on earth happened in between?
The man they call the Little Digger may be popular with the soldiers, but trouble beckons at home.
So one of Hughes' first moves was to head on over to Britain and France to get a glimpse of the Western Front. Now, Hughes spoke frequently of his youth, often emphasising one trait: he was hard as nails. His mum died when he was 6, and his dad then sent him to live in Wales with relatives. When he left the UK to come to Brisbane, he worked all sorts of jobs, even travelling from Brisbane to Rockhampton on foot. Point being that you don't mess with Hughes. Whereas Britain had pulled ones over on his predecessor, Hughes was adamant that they put more respect on Australia's name. So when Hughes arrived in London, he was quick to point out that Australia hadn't been properly consulted, and that Britain was living as though it was still the 1800s. He also voiced a number of territorial concerns. Take Papua New Guinea for instance. The southern part was formerly British and now Australian territory, however the northern part was German. When war broke out, Australia took this off of the Germans, and Hughes wanted a guarantee that they wouldn't get this back after the war. But there was also another more subtle concern: Japan.
Japan may be a crucial ally, but one question remains. Can we truly trust the way of the samurai?
So ironically, Japan also helped take German colonies across this region here. For Hughes, this was getting too close to Australia's sphere of influence. Britain had been a close ally of Japan's, helping them industrialise during the Meiji Restoration. They were a different race, spoke a different language, and had a very strong military culture. Hughes' point was to be very careful as to who you made your friend. There was also some added complexity around the White Australia policy. It might surprise you to learn that Britain were actually opponents to Australia prioritising white migrants because it actually stopped free movement across their empire. However, Hughes in fact urged the British Empire to abandon free trade with the outside world and instead create a block of tariffs that excluded Germany. Britain was in quite an interesting position. Enthusiasm for the war was waning, particularly under its leader Herbert Asquith, and they'd had to resort to conscription. But the presence of Hughes provided them with a unique opportunity. What if the dynamic Australian leader promoted the war for them?
An excited crowd waits in Liverpool Town Hall as the Australian Hughes prepares to plead with them to continue their war effort.
With Hughes pressing Britain to go even harder against Germany, they wheeled him out across the nation to drum up support for the war. Remember, Billy Hughes spoke fondly of his days in Wales and struck up a close relationship with a guy called David Lloyd George. Basically, he was Britain's Minister for War and would later become Prime Minister himself. Hughes could see that George was destined to take over from Asquith and so tried hard to build a rapport. Hughes' trip ended with a conference in Paris insisting that Australia get independent representation before making a trip to the trenches.
The man they call the little digger amongst the soldiers in the trenches.
The trenches had a profound impact on Hughes. By 1916, morale was low and the Somme offensive had failed to be the breakthrough that Britain were hoping for. Having seen Britain introduce conscription, Hughes was convinced that Australia ought to follow suit and upon return to Australia, floated the idea to his own party. The reaction was far worse than Hughes had calculated.
It's almost a certainty that the Labour Party will revolt against the man they chose to lead them only a year ago.
So when it came to conscription, the Liberal opposition was certainly for it, but the working class detested it for a number of reasons. The first was that they were very worried that their employers would use this as a chance to replace them with cheap foreign labour. This sentiment was only amplified by the fact that 2 ships of Maltese migrants were on their way over in late 1916. The fervour to support Britain had also been crushed by something else that happened in 1916.
The Sackville Street General Post Office in Dublin has now been seized by Irish Republicans.
The Labour Party had a huge Irish Catholic background, and with Britain quite strongly suppressing the Irish uprising, the idea that they'd then have to be forced to fight for Britain was one they hated. So if you look at the layout of Parliament in 1916, Hughes had no way of passing a conscription law through Parliament if his Labour Party wasn't going to go for it. However, he actually managed to persuade them into holding a plebiscite on the issue. A plebiscite's a public referendum, but is to change an act of Parliament rather than the Constitution. But we'll also use the word referendum because that was the one they used at the time. The reason that Labour went for the referendum was that they were very confident that the public would say no and end the conscription debate once and for all. Now, even before the vote went through, the reaction was pretty strong against Hughes. Key unions like the Wharf Labourers Union even expelled him. The day before the vote, Hughes then passed a regulation not to count the votes of men aged 21 to 35 who'd avoided the call to war, because according to Hughes, they were clearly incapable of voting impartially. The whole thing quite bitterly divided Australia, and so when the nation went to the polls, it wasn't good for Hughes. On the 28th of October 1916, 51.6% of Australians voted no to conscription, giving them a majority. It wasn't just an embarrassment for Hughes, but an embarrassment for the entire Labour Party, and so just 2 weeks after the vote, they called an emergency conference where this went down.
Billy Hughes has quit from the Labour Party, taking 23 others with him. The government is left in complete disarray.
So, including Hughes, 24 Labour members left to form a new party called National Labour. And if you look at the layout of Parliament here, that left no majority party. So instead, Hughes formed a coalition with the pro-conscription Liberal Party, and in February of 1917, the parties officially merged to become the Nationalist Party. Labour was left in the cold as Hughes had taken government away from them. But February 1917, at least according to the Julian calendar, was when something else happened in the war.
It's wild news coming out of Petrograd as Tsar Nicholas steps down, abandoning Russia in the middle of mankind's greatest war.
So the abdication of Tsar Nicholas in Russia threatened to collapse the entire Eastern Front against Germany. If that were to happen, all the German soldiers could be transported over here, and it could be game over. From Hughes' point of view, if Russia were to pull out of the war, then Australia and Britain needed to be ready to match those extra German numbers coming to the Western Front. But hold up, let's just stop there for a moment. There was no way that Hughes could actually increase recruitment because Australia had just literally rejected conscription. But you could always just try again.
What the actual Sigma? Australia looks poised to hold a second referendum on conscription just 1 year on from defeat.
Now, Hughes' idea for a second referendum may just seem plainly stupid, but it's worth noting what happened in May of 1917. Hughes' Nationalist Party won a landslide 53-22 victory at the election. Given the Nationalist Party was formed as a pro-conscription alliance, Hughes interpreted the election victory, at least in part, as Australia responding to the Russian Revolution. So Hughes went ahead and held a second referendum on conscription with a promise that if that were to be unsuccessful, he'd step down. And this referendum was far more ugly than the first. So of the Australian states, Queensland was the only one still under Labor control at the state level. So the Premier, Thomas Ryan, and his deputy, Ted Theodore, I know, funny name, were quite outspoken against conscription. After a printed tract of Theodore's arguments made quite the circulation throughout Queensland, Hughes had the Queensland government's printing office raided. Then on the campaign trail, Hughes spoke in the town of Warwick in Queensland South. While there, Hughes got egged. But that's not even the funny bit. Hughes was so dissatisfied with the level of protection provided by the Queensland Police Force that he formed his own police force, the Commonwealth Police Force. Later on, that Commonwealth Police Force would merge with the ACT Police to become the AFP. So Americans, if you're wondering how we got our equivalent of the FBI, that's how. However, as Australia went to the polls again, it was another defeat for Hughes, this time more convincing than the first, 54-46%. But what about Hughes' promise to step down if unsuccessful? Well, in January of 1918, Hughes did step down, but was sworn in again on the same day. So if you know your World War I history, 1918 is getting very close to the end of the war. By this point, American forces were now on the Western Front, and by the middle of the year, the Germans were on the retreat. So as Hughes was preparing to go back to London for end of war talks, he actually took a detour past America to talk to President Woodrow Wilson. And I might take a detour here as well. According to ChatGPT, only 30-40% of Australians know who Billy Hughes was. Compare that to his American counterpart, wherein 60-70% of Americans know who Woodrow Wilson was. That is wild considering Australia was in the war for 4 times as long, and then Hughes would go on to be pretty influential in World War II as well. For a developed country, we have to be one of the most historically illiterate nations in our own history. But it's okay, we're here to help. We've put together a 10-hour course on Australia from Federation to 1949. It's structured like a classroom with lectures and memory activities, and if you gave it just an hour or two a week, within 1 month you'd honestly become so much better acquainted with our history than anyone else. It's cheaper than a book, 50 times cheaper than a university history course, and all the hard work's done for you. Click the link here where you can play your part in closing the chasm between us and America. Now, after Britain didn't exactly warmly receive Hughes' concerns in the Pacific, Hughes tried his luck with Wilson. After all, a growing Japanese presence in the Pacific would also greatly affect American interests too. The Hughes-Wilson relationship would be crucial come the peace conferences. In the dying stages of the war, Hughes once again made it into the trenches, earning the soldiers' respect as they called him the Little Digger. By November, the truce was signed, and the key leaders made their way to Paris to discuss terms.
The leaders of the victorious war effort gathered together in Paris to decide the fate of the defeated.
Now, going into Paris, Hughes had 2 main concerns. The first was that Lloyd George, who was now Britain's Prime Minister, hadn't consulted the dominions of the Empire anywhere near enough to actually represent their interests. The second was that one of Wilson's 14 peace points was the removal of tariffs. Remember, his party was the Nationalist Party, which had ex-Liberal Party members, and the Liberals had ex-Protectionist Party members. In other words, some people in Hughes' party only got into politics to protect industries through tariffs. Now, to the credit of Hughes, he'd helped start up a number of unions in his former life, and so was no stranger for sticking up for a group of people who viewed themselves as being overlooked. And morality aside, he was a brilliant advocate for Australian interests at Paris. For instance, when Wilson challenged Hughes on the issue of tariffs, Wilson said that he was standing 5 million Australians against the 1.2 billion people from the Allied nations. Hughes simply replied, "I represent 60,000 dead." Now, the footnote to this story is that Hughes actually might not have heard Wilson. He was really reliant on a hearing aid, which he would often just turn off if he was losing interest in the conversation. Must be nice. But as Hughes conceded that Japan could have territories north of the equator, he made a couple of key demands. The first was that German New Guinea was given to Australia. Wilson wasn't stoked on this because of his point of self-determination. However, he was okay with a mandate system where a country governed another country until they were ready for independence. So Australia got not only New Guinea, but also Samoa on a 999-year mandate. The second was to do with Japan's proposal for a racial equality clause. It was pretty non-controversial, just something that would have said all races are equal. Billy Hughes said no. Think about it. Passing the clause would have meant undermining the basis of the White Australia policy, and Hughes' protests found fertile soil with Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a Democrat, and in the 20s, the South was Democrat-run, which meant that they were the more pro-segregation party. Allowing the clause to go through would have alienated his own party, and so Wilson and Hughes rejected the racial equality clause. Finally, the last demand that Hughes made was that Germany ought to pay big and supported France's call for tough reparations, which ended up happening. So having been successful on all of his demands, Hughes returned to London where he was hoisted on the shoulders of Anzac soldiers and greeted by a crowd of 500 Australians. But back at home, the reception wasn't anywhere near as warm.
Celebrations across the world remain somewhat muted. Soldiers are returning to now face a new danger, a pandemic.
So when Hughes returned, he returned to a struggling society. There was a global pandemic, a weariness of war, and an election coming up that year. With many elections in global history, once a crisis is over, voters often seek a new leader who represents normality. So not only did Hughes have to shrug off the image of wartime specialist, but he actually had to worry about a new party.
A collection of old farmers' unions, they are now gathered under a new name, the Country Party.
So the Country Party was a new minority party who felt that farmers weren't getting adequate representation in Parliament. We call them the Nationals today. And in 1919, a swing went against Hughes' nationalists as they lost 16 seats. However, Labor only picked up 4 seats. 11 of those nationalist seats instead went to the Country Party. As you can see, no party had a clear majority, and so Hughes had to form a coalition with this new Country Party. And regarding the peacetime government, there were some interesting things. He set up the CSIRO, founded the National Oil Refinery, and came to support Britain's alliance with Japan as a way of containing them. But in 1922, there was a Royal Commission into Working Conditions, and it found that the basic wage should be 40% higher. Of course, that was not endearing news to the public right before the next election. And in 1922, Labor picked up more seats than the Nationalists. But the saving grace for Hughes was that the Country Party's 14 seats could once again merge with the Nationalists' 26 seats to take down Labor. Unfortunately for Hughes, they had one demand for keeping the coalition. Hughes had to resign the leadership. Of course, Hughes rejected this proposal, and the Country Party clearly wanted someone they felt they could more easily control. But eventually, after copping enough internal pressure, Hughes resigned in 1923. But here's what's crazy. Hughes wouldn't leave office for another 20 years. That'd be like Paul Keating still being in Parliament today. Now, the Hughes story arc gets even wilder. So he was replaced by a guy called Stanley Bruce, and under Bruce, Hughes was relegated to just being a backbencher. But Hughes was far from irrelevant. At times, he'd even defect back towards Labor. The most notable example of this was when Bruce tried to abolish essentially what was the High Court for Industrial Matters. Hughes flipped to Labor and said that either a referendum or an election must come first. Sure enough, Bruce opted for an election against Labor, but just 2 years later, the Labor Party would splinter again.
Labor faces a crisis. An unholy alliance between Jack Lang and Joseph Lyons sees James Scullin's government decimated as the United Australia Party looks destined for victory.
Now, the background to Labor's split in 1931 is quite complex. It involves Jack Lang, and I actually go through it in the course, so go sign up. But the net result of this was that disaffected but powerful Labor MP Joseph Lyons brought across a number of supporters to merge with the Nationalist Party. Bereft of leadership options, Lyons would then actually lead this new party called the United Australia Party. Now, Hughes supported this move. After all, he coined the good old ditch Labor and joined the opposition party manoeuvre. But when Hughes sided with Labor, he was actually expelled from the Nationalist Party. He then formed his own Australian party, but the formation of the UAP gave him a chance to get back into a majority party, and he snatched that opportunity. So in 1932, the UAP won a convincing election, making Joseph Lyons the Prime Minister. That was at least until this news story in 1939.
The Prime Minister has died from a heart attack. While the nation mourns, those within the coalition are wondering who will now take over.
So upon Lyons' death, there were only 2 real candidates for leadership of the party. The first was a guy you might have heard of called Robert Menzies, but the second was Billy Hughes. Just to reiterate, if Hughes would have emerged successful, he would have come back as Prime Minister. But the vote went mighty close, and Menzies only edged it out 23 votes to 19. Like, if just 3 UAP members changed their vote, we go into World War II with Billy Hughes once again our Prime Minister. So not even 5 months after the leadership ballot, Poland was invaded by Germany and Menzies led the government into World War II. During that time, Hughes served as Attorney General. But mid-war, we changed parties.
The Prime Minister has resigned this morning. While meeting with Churchill in London, it was no secret the United Australia Party was seeking to take him down.
So, facing a vote of no confidence from within, again, the course goes through Menzies' World War II performance, Menzies resigned the leadership. Now, the UAP Country Party coalition was dependent upon the support of 2 independents, Arthur Coles and Alex Wilson. Upon the UAP essentially knifing Menzies, they then flipped to support John Curtin's Labour government. What this meant was that the coalition was now in opposition and would be led by the smaller Country Party. Still, the UAP needed a leader, and up stepped the 80-year-old Billy Hughes. Now, during the war, Hughes served in Curtin's All-Parties War Council, much to the disapproval of his own party. By 1943, Curtin was proving to be an effective wartime leader, and Labour smashed the opposition in the election. The UAP went back to the drawing board, and not only let Menzies return as party leader, but he then led the entire opposition. Now, in 1944, the UAP's official policy was to not serve in Curtin's All-Parties War Council, but Billy Hughes went full Billy Hughes and rejoined the council, which then caused him to get expelled from the party. Again, that's 3 parties he's been expelled from now. Now, after the war, Menzies reorganised the party. There'd been too many alliances and mergers, and he wanted the party to go back to what it was before Hughes, the Liberal Party. As a token of peace towards him, Hughes was allowed to join the Liberal Party in 1945, with Menzies joking that he'd been a part of all parties at some time or another. And in 1951, Hughes was still serving in Parliament, winning the seat of Bradfield in the Upper North Shore. This was his 20th straight election win, and in 1952, Hughes was still going at 90 years old. That's pretty much 10 years older than Joe Biden is today. Now, 1952 would be the final year of Hughes as he died in office. He served 51 years, lasting from Queen Victoria to Queen Elizabeth, and was the second last inaugural federal politician to die. Having lived through half a century of Australian politics, he not only broke Labor himself, but was on the ground the second time Labor broke with the Premier's Plan crisis. This featured in this photo on the screen here. It's a lovely photo of Billy Hughes shaking hands with Stanley Bruce. We need to ask ourselves this question: who is Stanley Bruce? Where does this guy come from? Because we haven't really heard of him on the political scene up until so far. Well, the thing to know about Stanley Bruce is that he was a World War I veteran. He fought in Gallipoli and on the Western Front, and he actually got injured in both of those. So he was a highly regarded young soldier. He also had an extremely upper-class background. We're talking Melbourne Grammar here. He was the son of a successful importing firm. We'll come on and say that in just a second. And so he's a really influential person because he's an upper-class, handsome soldier who's been shot and is effectively a war hero. So during the 1917 conscription referendum, when that kind of comes around, what we actually see is we see Stanley Bruce start to be an advocate for the yes vote to introduce conscription. The Nationalist Party actually picks this up. They're like, whoa, this is a kind of young, handsome man who is advocating our policies really well. He's also got a lot of marketability because he's a World War I veteran, though they weren't calling it World War I at the time. And so they actually pick him up and enroll him into the Nationalist Party, and then he kind of takes off from there. And during Billy Hughes' government, Stanley Bruce actually serves the post as being treasurer to Billy Hughes' government. He's got a meteoric rise in the party. Think of him as being like a Malcolm Turnbull sort of figure that replaced the merchant banking background and the Kerry Packer's lawyer background with being a World War I veteran. But point being, he's got a very meteoric rise within the party quite quickly. So he becomes really important. But for Billy Hughes coming back from World War I, he's got a number of different issues. So remember, 1916, Billy Hughes goes to London, he goes to the Western Front. He comes home in mid-1916, and then from 1916 to 1917, he unsuccessfully twice tries to get conscription passed through a plebiscite. They use the word referendum at the time. 1918, he then goes back over to Europe to negotiate in the Paris peace conferences and kind of stays there through to 1919. 1919, he comes home and there's a number of different issues that he's got to face. The first one is this one. It's the Spanish flu. So again, it got a little bit of attention during COVID because it was like, wow, we're getting another pandemic 100 years on from the last one. But the Spanish flu was devastating, had a massive death toll. And so people were being wiped out by that after the war. But on a more kind of local level, he's actually got all of these soldiers who he needs to repatriate and just settle into regular society. Again, it's kind of murky territory. Do they just go back and pick up where their old job left off? The entire economy changed throughout the war period. And so kind of resettling these soldiers and rehabilitating them into regular society was actually quite a challenge. He personally was very popular abroad. And he achieved a lot for Australia in the Paris Peace Conferences, not necessarily from a moral point of view, but from a power point of view. But he still has to deal with the fact that twice people knocked him back at the referendum booth. So that's going to take a massive hit to his brand and his popularity. We remember last year that people were even calling Albanese to resign when the Indigenous voice to Parliament didn't get up. And so imagine that, but actually a far more heated debate than the conscription one actually was. Than the voice to Parliament actually was. And imagine that happening twice while there's a war going on in the background. So he's still got to come back, and his political image in Australia is largely damaged. The most devastating thing for Billy Hughes, though, was he actually had to deal with a new party called the Country Party, and if you know your political history, you would know that this ends up becoming the National Party when Joh Bjelke-Petersen gets it changed in the 1970s. So the Country Party are now on the scene, and they're actually threatening the Nationalist Party in a lot of key seats that would have been considered either safe or marginal. So again, the Nationalist Party are the ones who hurt most from this new Country Party that's emerged on the scene. So let's have a look at this Country Party. Who are they and what do they want? This guy on the screen actually wasn't the initial leader of the Country Party. Basically, throughout Australian and throughout the different states in Australia, you had a number of different farmers' unions who basically put themselves on the scene to be a counterweight to the Labor Party. And basically, so they didn't necessarily challenge in the key seats, and I've gone out of focus here. They didn't necessarily challenge in those same seats, but basically they were considered a counterweight to Labor in Parliament. If Labor can play the role, remember historically what had they done? They played the role of being a lobby group to a majority party. The Country Party viewed themselves as being the same thing, but having a bit more luck with a party like the Nationalist Party. So they only start to really pop up in the late 1910s. Probably the most important one was the Victorian Farmers Union, and they actually held a number of seats in the Victorian State Parliament and even one in federal Parliament as well. And basically they were like, look, they called themselves non-political. That wasn't true at all. They were incredibly political. But basically they said, when Labor's being unreasonable, we want to be a counterweight to that. Certainly they had no ambitions of governing, and they kind of knew they, as a farmers' party, they'd never going to govern the metropolitan areas, though Joh Bjelke-Petersen ends up doing it. But they knew they were never going to be the majority party. And so basically they viewed themselves as a lobby group to kind of extract concessions from a majority party. In the two-party system, you have the Labor Party on the one side and the Nationalist Party on the other. And given that they viewed themselves as a counterweight to Labor, they knew the Nationalist Party would be where the soil was most fertile. And they also kind of said that, look, we had some representation with the Protectionist Party, and they could kind of put tariffs on imports to protect farmed goods from Australia. But when that went away with the Fusion Party, we lost that representation, and we really struggled. So it's an interesting group, but they are advocating it essentially for better representation for farmers, and that farm owners don't have to pay their workers as much as well. That's a pretty key detail there. Now, what happened was they basically got organised for the 1919 election. Like, look, there's so many of us across the country in different areas. We actually all want the same thing. We're just not really concerned about each other's farms because we're focusing on our own. What if we actually merged, became one organised group, and then together we can actually put a whole lot more pressure because together we'll have a collection of seats and be able to kind of lobby with more influence. And so in 1919, they basically kind of pulled themselves together into the one party. They called themselves the Country Party. They were also very socially conservative as well. That's not surprising considering rural areas are generally far more conservative on social issues than metropolitan areas. But they basically advocated for a strong sense of social conservatism and particularly conservative beliefs regarding Indigenous issues. And if you kind of think about it, it makes obvious sense. Who are farmers? They're largely descendants from people from the British Empire or directly from Britain themselves who've come to Australia for the farmland. And they basically view Indigenous people as being a threat to the amount of land that they can acquire to have the most profitable farms they could possibly have. So again, they tended to have quite socially conservative beliefs, and that was most noticeable when it came to the issue of what to do with Indigenous people. Remember, this is going into 1920s society where kind of you've got the well-known assimilation policy going on. The leader was initially a guy called William McWilliams. Great name, very funny guy, quite a strange guy by all accounts, but most people said he was quite quirky. He was quickly dethroned by a guy called Earl Page, and Earl Page really brought a lot of credibility to the Country Party. So he was a doctor who studied in Sydney, but then he moved back to Grafton in kind of central New South Wales. By the way, great chippy at Grafton. I kind of stopped there a couple of times on the way home from Queensland. If I've driven home from Queensland, there's a really great chippy. I don't know what it's called, but it does great hot chips. If you're from Grafton, tell me the one so I can kind of give them a proper shout out. But Earl Page is from Grafton, really reputable surgeon, and is quite well respected across the board. And so he brings a lot of credibility to this Country Party because he's seen as a very positive figure in the community. So again, he makes it, again, imagine going from someone like Bob Catter to, what's the vet called? Chris Brown? Is that the vet?
If you picked up a spare $20 over Christmas,
imagine going
heading over
like
to
Bob
join
Catter
the
to
10
Chris
Prime
Brown
Ministers in 10 days course. Some of today's lecture snippets are from that course, and it has activities to consolidate your learning too. The modules are all there for you, and for just an hour a day, you'll be an expert by January the 10th. But if you don't have the cash, still join our website for free. You'll get a study guide PDF for where to direct your research